There is a line that a golf club maker said once, a long time ago, and it has never quite let me go. He said that every golfer has two swings. He said there is the swing a man uses during the last 3 holes of a tournament, when everything is on the line. And then there is the swing he uses the rest of the time, when nobody is really watching. He meant it as a joke about golfers, and it is a good one, but hold on to that line, because by the end of this story, you are going to hear it a second way. Because the man who said it built a company that had 2 swings too. There was the one it showed the world, and there was the real one underneath, the one that was already coming apart while everybody was still watching the show. The man who said it was named Toney Penna. And this is the strange, quiet story of how he lost the one thing a craftsman can never make another copy of. He did not lose it to a fire. He did not lose it to a lawsuit or a crash or a single reckless bet. The club stayed beautiful to the very end. The craftsmanship never once slipped. And that is exactly the part that hurts. Because he lost it to a signature on a piece of paper. He lost his own name. This is the rise and fall of Toney Penna. But to understand what was taken from him, you first have to understand what he built. And to understand what he built, you have to go back to a boy who arrived here with nothing at all. He was born in Naples, in Italy, in the winter of 1908. He was still a small boy when the family crossed the ocean. They settled near Chicago in the way that so many immigrant families did in those years. And like so many immigrant children of that generation, young Toney found the golf course from the wrong side of the fence. He did not arrive through the front gate. He arrived through the caddy yard. He carried other men's bags for money. He watched other men swing for hours on end. And somewhere in those long afternoons, with the leather straps cutting into his shoulder, something began to take shape in his mind. He began to understand golf clubs in a way that most players never would. He learned the game well enough to play it for a living. He turned professional, and he was good at it. Between the late 1930s and the late 1940s, he won 4 times on the professional tour. He stood on leaderboards beside the biggest names of the era. He finished near the very top of the US Open. He contended at the PGA Championship more than once. By any honest measure, Toney Penna was a fine tournament player. But playing was never the thing that truly set him apart. Plenty of men could play the game. What Toney Penna could do was rarer by far. He could see a golf club the way a sculptor sees a raw block of stone. He could pick up a rough persimmon head and feel, right there in his palms, exactly where the weight wanted to live. Before he was finished, he would hold 4 separate patents for golf club design. He understood loft and lie and balance as pure instinct, never as dry theory. Other men read the numbers off a chart. Toney Penna felt them in his fingers. And there was one more gift, harder to name than the rest. He had style. Real style, the kind of thing you simply cannot teach a person. He stood barely 5 feet and 6 inches tall, and yet he dressed like a man twice that size. He wore tailored clothes and custom-made shoes everywhere he went. He even unusually spelled his own first name, with that extra letter tucked inside it. He did it on purpose. He understood something most craftsmen never grasp. He understood that a name itself is a thing you can design. That rare gift for design is what carried him to the company that would first make him famous. It carried him to MacGregor. In those years, MacGregor was on its way to becoming the single most important name in American golf. And Toney Penna became the beating heart of the whole operation. He worked hand in hand with the greatest players of the age. He built clubs and refined them right alongside the legendary Ben Hogan. He worked closely with the great Byron Nelson. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the finest ball strikers the game had ever produced. He took what those men felt in their hands, and he turned it into something they could actually play. Think for a moment about the room he was standing in during those years. He was designing clubs for Ben Hogan, a man so exacting about equipment that he would reject a club over a fraction of a degree. He was working with Byron Nelson, whose swing was so pure that engineers would later build a testing machine and name it after him. These were not easy men to satisfy. These were the most demanding hands in the entire sport, and Toney Penna satisfied them again and again and again. That is the part worth holding on to. It is one thing to sell clubs to weekend golfers who will never know the difference. It is a completely different thing to earn the trust of a perfectionist like Hogan. When a man like that plays your design, it is not a sale, it is a verdict. And the verdict on Toney Penna was that the man was a master, and he rose, and he rose again. He climbed all the way to executive vice president of the company. He helped drive MacGregor to the absolute summit of the American golf industry. He pushed it clear past Spalding. He pushed it past Wilson. He pushed it past every single rival that dared to try and match it. When people speak of the golden age of persimmon woods and forged blades, they are very often speaking of clubs that carried his own fingerprints. He gave more than 3 decades of his working life to that company, 30 years. A complete career poured entirely into one place. He put his eye and his hands and his instinct into MacGregor. And in return, MacGregor gave him a seat at the very top of the game. But a man like Toney Penna does not spend 30 years dreaming of another man's name on the head cover. A man like Toney Penna dreams of his own name. And eventually, that dream grew far too loud to ignore. So in 1967, he did the thing that every craftsman secretly longs to do. It is the thing that almost none of them ever actually dare to try. He walked away. He left MacGregor, the giant he had helped to build, and he set out to put his own name on his own clubs at last. He founded the Toney Penna Golf Company. He set it down in Jupiter, in Florida, in the warm coastal light, and he built it the way he built absolutely everything. He built it with deep care and with unmistakable flair. And here's the truly remarkable part. He did not do it alone. Toney Penna had spent a lifetime moving among famous men, and those famous men believed in him completely. When his new factory finally opened its doors, none other than Bob Hope showed up in person to celebrate the moment. The crooner Bing Crosby backed the venture with his own name. So did the beloved singer Perry Como. And Como was more than a backer, he was a real friend. And there is one small story that tells you exactly what kind. Penna once joked that the only thing keeping him off the big professional tour anymore was his lack of hair. A week later, a package arrived from Perry Como. Inside was a hairpiece and a short note. The note said one word. It said, "Go." That was the world Toney Penna lived in. A world where the most famous entertainers in America sent him gifts and cheered him on. Stop and sit with that for just a second. 3 of the most adored entertainers in all of America stood behind this small golf company in Florida. They did it because they believed in the man whose name was painted on the door. It was, in every way that truly counts, a dream fully realized. For a lifetime, he had built glory for other people under other names. Now, at long last, he had a company that was entirely his own. His name was on the shaft, his hands were on the clubs, and the very best players in the world were about to come knocking, and come knocking they did, because the clubs were nothing short of extraordinary. This was never a vanity project. It did not simply trade on a famous name while delivering nothing behind it. The Toney Penna clubs were the genuine article, and the greatest players on earth proved it in the only place that ever truly matters. They proved it on the game's biggest stages, under the heaviest pressure the sport can produce. Tom Watson won major championships with them. Lee Trevino, that magician of the golf swing, won with these clubs too. The dashing Seve Ballesteros carried them across the water. Gary Player, one of the finest men to ever walk a fairway, won major titles playing a Penna design. Read that group of names again, and read it slowly this time. Watson, Trevino, Ballesteros, Player. That is not a list of merely good professionals. That is a roll call of outright legends. These are men whose names are carved into the Hall of Fame forever, and every last one of them trusted their major championships to clubs bearing the name of a 5'6" immigrant from Naples. At the company's very peak, the numbers were staggering. It is said that as many as 1 in 5 professionals on the entire tour carried a Toney Penna wood in the bag. 1 in 5 men out there on tour, he had done the impossible thing. He had proven, beyond any argument at all, that the magic had never truly belonged to MacGregor. The magic had always been his. He had left the giant behind him, and he had built something that could stand as its equal. For a stretch of years, it was simply glorious. Picture the scene down in Jupiter in those days. the Florida sun on a low workshop building, tour players stopping in to have their clubs tuned by the master himself, the famous friends drifting through Hope and Crosby and Como, lending their glamour to a little factory that made wooden clubs. The Penna name was not just respected in those years. It was fashionable. It carried a whiff of celebrity and old Hollywood mixed with the honest smell of sawdust and lacquer. But here's a thing worth saying plainly because it is the heart of everything that follows. A name like that is a promise. It is a promise about one particular pair of hands. When you saw that gold script on the sole of a club, it meant something exact. It meant that the little man from Naples had looked at this piece of wood and judged it worthy. That promise was the whole value of the name, and a promise, unlike a factory, is a very fragile thing to sell. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the world that golf equipment lived inside by the 1970s. That world was changing fast, and it was not changing in the craftsman's favor at all. The small, proud, founder-run club makers were quietly becoming an endangered species. All around them, the big conglomerates were moving in. These were the sprawling, diversified corporations that made 100 unrelated things and truly cared about none of them. Picture the kind of company we mean here. One corporate parent might make lawn sprinkler systems and children's toboggans and hockey sticks and baseball gloves, all at the very same time. Everything sat together under one roof. Everything got measured against the very same cold spreadsheet. One of those companies was Rawlings. You almost certainly know that name already from baseball. You know it from the gloves and the balls of the major leagues. Yet Rawlings itself sat inside a far larger conglomerate. It was a sprawling corporate thing assembled over years from dozens of unrelated businesses. Earlier that same decade, this parent had swallowed a maker of baseball bats and toboggans and archery bows and simply bolted it on. That was how these machines grew. They did not build, they acquired, they absorbed. And to a machine like that, a company is never really a company. It is a set of numbers on a page. It has a cost, and a margin, and a growth rate, and very little else that matters. The people who ran it had likely never held a persimmon wood in their lives. They had certainly never watched a man like Toney Penna grind one by hand. To them, golf was simply a category with room to grow, and in the middle of the 1970s, that corporate machine decided that it wanted to be in the golf business too. In 1976, Rawlings Golf was formally set up as its own division inside that conglomerate. And listed among the products under that new Rawlings Golf banner was something deeply personal. Right there, printed alongside the balls and the bags and the ordinary gloves, sat three familiar words: Toney Penna Custom Equipment. Read that line quietly because the whole tragedy is folded up inside it. This was the name that Bob Hope had come to celebrate in person. This was the name that Watson and Trevino and Ballesteros and Player had trusted with their major championships. This was the name of the man from Naples who gave 30 years to one company just so he could finally have his own. And now it had become a single entry, a line item, a product, filed under a division, tucked inside a company, buried deep inside a conglomerate. The deal was done, and the name did not belong to the man anymore. Now understand what a deal like this one truly means. It is far too easy to say the plain words and completely miss the knife that is hidden inside them. When a craftsman sells his company, the lawyers will always tell you it is a happy ending. The founder finally collects his reward. The brand gets fresh resources behind it. The name gets to live on into the future. Everybody wins, they say. That is the story told at the signing table, always in the very best light. But remember what the name actually was. A name is a promise about a pair of hands. And you cannot really sell that. You can sell the letters. You can sell the gold script and the logo and the right to stamp it on a club. And the moment you cut the name away from the hands it was promising, the promise is already broken. You have kept the label. You have thrown away the only thing the label ever meant. And that is precisely what began to unfold. The company Toney Penna had founded on his own name now lived inside a machine. That machine held no particular love for persimmon. It held no particular reverence for the man himself. It carried no memory whatsoever of Bob Hope standing proudly at the factory door. To that machine, the Penna name was simply one more asset. It was a thing to be deployed wherever it might squeeze out the most money. And an asset never gets a vote about its own future. Toney Penna, the man, would not live to see the full indignity of what came next, but his name would be made to suffer it in his place, because a name, once it has been bought, can always be handed onward, and this name most certainly was. As the years rolled past, the Penna operation drifted further and further from the man who first dreamed it up. The golf division changed hands, it changed shape, and then came the final turn of the wheel. It carries a kind of bitter irony that a novelist would be embarrassed to invent from scratch. The Penna operation became tied directly to Jack Nicklaus. Now, if you have watched this channel before, you already know exactly why that one detail lands the way it does. Jack Nicklaus was the great public face of MacGregor, and MacGregor, remember, was the company that Toney Penna had helped raise into a giant across 30 long years. It was the very company he had chosen to leave to start his own. Then Nicklaus himself walked away from MacGregor, and he attached his equipment to the Penna operation instead. Sit with the strange shape of that for a moment. The name of the man who left MacGregor became the vehicle for the champion who also left MacGregor. One of the last products to carry the true Penna lineage was rebadged and reborn under the Nicklaus label. The operation, in the very end, effectively morphed into Nicklaus Golf. And where exactly was Toney Penna in all of this? By that point, the man was inactive in the very company that still wore his name. He was on the outside looking in. The name was on the clubs. The man was not. They had been separated. And that quiet separation is the most thorough way imaginable to destroy the Toney Penna company. You never have to smash such a thing to pieces at all. You only have to lift the maker's hands off it and then keep the label running without him. Compare that ending to how it might have gone instead. Compare it for just a moment to the survivors of this same brutal era. A name is a promise about a pair of hands. Some companies understood that, and they guarded the promise with everything they had. Think of Ping, a company born in a humble garage. It was guarded fiercely by the very family that made it, and it still stands today as its own proud, independent thing. Think of Titleist. That company built a fortress around a single, relentless idea of quality, and it never once let go of that idea. Those names still mean exactly what they were built to mean. They mean it because someone fought hard to keep the promise attached to the hands. Toney Penna's name never got that kind of protection. It got a long series of owners instead. It got spreadsheets and divisions and quiet rebadges. And the one thing that made the name valuable in the first place was that promise of a master's hands. It was the first thing sold off. It was the last thing anyone in charge bothered to remember. That is the whole difference between a name that is kept and a name that is merely owned. One of them is protected by people who genuinely care. The other one is simply spent. And spending a name is a quiet thing. It does not happen all at once. It happens the way a good coat wears out, a little at a time. One day you look down, and the thing you loved is simply gone. Nobody in a boardroom ever announced that the Toney Penna name would stop meaning what it meant. They did not have to announce it. They only had to keep selling it year after year further from the hands that gave it worth. And slowly, quietly, the meaning drained out of it. The word stayed. The thing behind the word did not. I want to step out from behind the story for just a moment here. I think this one is genuinely different from most of the tales we tell on this channel, and I think it is worth saying out loud exactly why that is. Most of the time, on this channel, we hand you a villain. There is a single bad owner. There is one reckless decision or one greedy hand that reaches in and wrecks something beautiful, and you get to feel good about hating that villain because the crime is right there in plain sight. This story does not really give you one of those. There is no cackling villain to point at here. There is only a signature and a spreadsheet and the slow, ordinary machinery of business doing precisely what it was built to do. Nobody woke up one morning setting out to hurt Toney Penna. They simply valued his name, and they did not value the thing his name actually stood for. And that gap turned out to be its very own kind of ruin. That, I think, is the version of the story that should frighten a craftsman most of all. Not the arsonist with the match, the accountant with the pen. Toney Penna died in 1995. He was 87 years old. He passed away in Palm Beach Gardens in Florida. It was the same warm sunshine where he had once opened a factory with a movie star standing at the door. He had lived a long life and a rich one. It was full of famous friends and major champions and clubs so beautiful they belonged under glass. He had climbed the whole impossible ladder. He went from an immigrant caddy yard all the way to the top of the golf industry. And he did it twice over. He did it once under MacGregor's name, then he did it all over again under his very own. But the company that carried his name was, by then, no longer his in any real way. It had been bought, it had been folded into a bigger thing, it had been handed onward again and again and again, and finally it had been absorbed into the world of the very company he had once left behind. The man was gone. The name simply lived on without him. And it lives on even now, because here's the final twist. And it is a strange one to sit with. Decades after that first fateful deal, the Toney Penna name was revived all over again. It was brought back by a holding company that had nothing at all to do with the man himself. Its purpose was to sell brand new clubs to a brand new generation. That generation had never once watched him grind a persimmon head by hand. The label endures to this very day. At this exact moment, it is a brand that you can walk out and buy. But stop and ask yourself what that name really means now. It is a beautiful word printed on a modern club. It is attached to a story that most buyers will never actually hear. It points back to a pair of hands that stopped shaping clubs a very long time ago. The name survived all the years. The man behind it did not get to keep it. And now, at the very end, we come back to the line we started with, the one that would not let me go. Toney Penna said that every golfer has two swings. The one he shows the world in the final holes when the pressure is on, and the quiet, honest one underneath, the real one that tells you who he actually is. He spent his whole life reading that gap. He could look at any man's swing and see the truth hiding under the performance. It was his genius. It was how he built clubs that the greatest players on earth trusted with everything. And in the cruelest twist of all, his own name developed exactly that same gap. There was the swing it showed the world, the gold script, the tour winners, the famous friends, the beautiful clubs in the display case, and then there was the real one underneath, the honest one, the one the spreadsheets knew. That name had already been sold. It had already been cut loose from his hands. It was already drifting towards strangers and rivals, already becoming a label with nothing behind it. He built glory for MacGregor across 30 years. Then he left to build his own. He put his clubs in the hands of living legends and his name on the door of his very own house. And then, with the ink of one single deal, that name slipped out of his hands forever. It went on to be owned by strangers. It was handed to rivals. It was sold again and again, long after he was gone. Toney Penna spelled his name in his own particular way. He did it because he understood something better than almost anyone alive. He understood that a name is the most personal thing a craftsman will ever own. In the very end, it was the only thing he could not keep. Maybe you have one of his clubs sitting in your garage right now, a wood with that gold script still on the sole. If you do, I would truly love to hear about it. Tell me two things down in the comments below. Tell me which Toney Penna club you owned. And then tell me the name of the course where you first put it into play. Those are the stories that keep a real name alive, the honest way it was always meant to be kept. If this story meant something to you today, take a moment to subscribe. We are working our way patiently through the whole lost world of American golf. We save one great name at a time, and the next name that we rescue just might have been sitting quietly in your own bag for 40 years. Thank you for watching.